We got the worst kind of inflation you can possibly imagine out of that. Silver was available in limited quantity, and so if you wanted to have trade, you had to get silver, which pushed up the value of the currency. But the Spanish were literally mining the currency, and whenever the Spanish had an interest, they would go into a local market and buy up whatever they needed: equipment, steel, ships, men, whatever, to launch wars. So you got disruption, you got supply side inflation, you got demand side inflation. At the same time, you had global disconnects and disruptions. So yes, it was our first true global currency, but it was never going to last because of the way the Spanish managed it. The Brits came up with the pound and gold, and that was a technological currency because they had their technological revolution at a very similar time frame. And as they became the global navy, combined with the Industrial Revolution, they were able to do it on military and economic terms, and that was much better for everyone, unless, of course, you are one of the hundreds of countries that happen to be under the colonial boot every once in a while, because the Brits really did control everything for a while. That was ultimately displaced when the technologies of industrialization went other places. And so by the time we get to the end of World War II, France is industrialized, the Netherlands is, Germany is, Japan is, the United States is. And because of the destruction of the war, the United States emerged from the war with an economy roughly the same size as everybody else put together, meaning we didn't even have an option as to what the currency would be then. We are now entering a period where globalization is breaking down. And the United States was already, of the major countries, the one least involved in trade. So again, at this moment, the United States is the only one on the board. Now, if you fast forward 50 years, if we get a different global economic system that is based on something else, if we find out what sort of economic model we're going to get in an environment where demographic decay has been going on for decades and capitalism and socialism and fascism no longer work, then we'll have a conversation about what the currency is going to be. But right now, the United States has the healthiest demography of all of the G20 countries except for Argentina. It's the largest economy by far. It's the least involved in international trade. And it has rule of law. So you might not like the United States for this, that, or the other reason. But from a mechanical point of view of what makes a good currency, no one else even scratches one of those categories, much less all three. What you seem to be describing is the dollar with another name.
Yeah, basically.
Yeah, sure. I mean, the idea of a central bank currency is really just a digital version of the paper currency, and I would argue we're kind of going that way anyway. They don't even have checks in the United Kingdom anywhere, and we're getting to a greater and greater percentage of transactions that are handled online. The question is whether there's a use case for something that's separate, and from the Federal Reserve's point of view, there really isn't one at this point. So one of the many, many outcomes of the Bretton Woods Accords is it changed demographic structures. Because in the pre-industrial world, we all lived on farms and kids were free labor, so you'd have as many as you could stand, plus one, because that's how you find out it's too many. But as we urbanized and industrialized and started taking industrial jobs, and we moved into towns where kids become really expensive conversation pieces. So we went from, on average around the world, having 7 of them, today having less than 2. And as that happened, the demographic structure of the world shifted. And so it's not that we're running out of children. A lot of the advanced world ran out of children 40 years ago. This decade, most of the advanced world runs out of working age adults, with the Germans and the Koreans and the Italians and the Chinese and the Japanese furthest along. So this model of global goods exchange that we've had for 75 years, this was ending anyway. And that does shake up the economic picture and maybe make room for something new. The problem with saying that that change is going to be front-loaded is that the United States and Mexico are 2 of the healthiest demographies in the world, and that's where the currency is headquartered. So for the country that benefits the most from this system and is most able to maintain it without changing the rules of the game, there's not really an impetus to go for something new. We have to wait for these other countries to figure out what is a post-consumption economic structure, what is a post-export economic structure. And until that is figured out, we won't know what kind of the parameters are of the new economic model. And only then can we start talking about currency. Gone lopsided for a long time before that. The U.S. economy was actually larger than the British economy back at the Civil War. And by the time we got to the end of World War II, or by the time we got to 1939, it was bigger than France and Britain and Russia and Germany combined. And then the war smashed all of those. So it was really just admitting the obvious at that point. We never had a fight between the Brits and the Americans over the system. We're not going to have a fight between the Americans and someone else over the system because there's no one on a growth trajectory to battle it out according to the old rules. So for something new to follow that rough pattern, there's going to have to be some sort of global shock where everyone agrees things have to change, including the United States. But that global shock is not likely to overly harm the United States, which makes it a bit of a reach to say that this is something that could happen soon. So probably, and we're getting deep into the crystal ball here, where it gets very cloudy, probably what we're talking about is 30 years from now, when Germany, Japan, Korea, and the others have maybe figured out an economic model that is not dependent on consumption or production. I have no idea what that looks like. But we have to do that at scale before we're talking about any sort of meaningful transition from what works very well for today's leading power. It's not as much as you might think because it requires you have a capital account, which makes it more difficult to regulate your own financial system. You have a lot of hot money going both ways. But it does mean that there is a stability injected into your system, and that stability allows you a lot more ballast. So a great example is what happened during the Nixon period when we decided to go off the gold standard. There weren't conversations about that internationally. The Nixon administration just decided almost overnight that we're going to move off and go to a full float. And in the words of the Treasury Secretary of the time, it's our currency, it's your problem, because the alternative for everyone else was worse. Still is today. I mean, leaving aside the idea that the dollar is going away is silly. Let's say the dollar did break as the reserve currency overnight. Let's just say that happened. Then we're a normal currency. And we're still the currency for the U.S. domestic economy. And roughly 90% of the U.S. economy is held within the United States, and another 5% is held within Mexico and Canada. So you only really have 5% exposure to the wider world. As for all of the debt, yes, a large portion of that is held abroad, but the U.S. still has control over its own money supply, and that debt is already out there. And every once in a while, there's this delightful conversation between some wackadoo Chinese ideologue and the U.S. Fed in St. Louis, where the wackadoo ideologue says, you know, if we really want to stick to the United States, we're just going to dump all $3 trillion of our bond holdings overnight. And you always get this same snarky response from the St. Louis Fed that says something like, well, that would be really interesting because the debt would probably trade at 30 cents on the dollar very, very quickly. But I don't know if you knew this, China, but the U.S. Federal Reserve controls the U.S. money supply. And it's mostly digital now. So we would just click a couple buttons and expand the money supply by the exact number of that 3 trillion discounted 70% and retire the whole thing. You would save us over $2 trillion in an hour, and you would be out over $2 trillion in an hour. That would be brilliant. Please do that. And then we never hear from that ideologue again because he's brought shame to China for being so stupid. So no, even in the worst case scenario where Martian currency takes over, the U.S. is still a normal currency for U.S. purposes. Now, there is a cost in that scenario. That would probably